everyone, it is Jazz here. Today I'm doing the genre busting tag. I was tagged by the creators of this tag from the Bookaxe channel. I will link you to their channel in the description. It's really awesome. This tag is composed of 7 questions that basically lead us to discuss different things that we like about books other than just their genres. So it's really interesting, and let's just jump into the question. Question 1, do you prefer books that develop characters in depth or books with a fast-paced plot? Obviously, we want a nice even thing of both, but I would say that I gear more towards character-driven plot. I like the idea that characters' choices can be a driving force in a plot of a story, and also that characters' choices can be based on their backstory, where they're coming from, what their lives are like, and that is really entertaining to me from a psychological standpoint. That is if the writer is really good at showing and not telling what this character is about, because if you're just telling me things about the character, it will definitely, for me, slow down the plot and also make the character almost not as realistic to me, so it's definitely a balancing act. Question 2, do you prefer lighthearted, optimistic books or books that explore the darker side of life? This definitely depends on my mood. If I'm sad or really busy, I'm going to lean towards those optimistic books, but just on my normal baseline, I would probably say that I gear more towards darker books, because a lot of my favorite authors, my top 3 being Neil Gaiman, Stephen King, and Laurie Halse Anderson, do kind of focus on those darker elements of life. I think it is harder with solely optimistic books to really create the layers that I would like to see in character and plot development. The optimistic books that I really enjoy are still ones that do have great sadness or kind of some kind of dark element underlying it to kind of balance out the optimism. It's like optimism despite the dark stuff that's happening. And also, I think I like darker elements because I have a very weird sense of humor. I feel like when darker things are happening, the characters are more likely to be sarcastic. The stuff that I find funny in books is usually the stuff that is in the dark books when people are being sarcastic. Number 3, do you prefer books that get straight to the point or books that challenge language and style? So if you have ever heard me do one of my many rants about how I don't like authors that write with super long sentences, you know that I prefer that people just get to the point. Now, I don't know if this comes from the fact that I enjoy writing poetry and songs, and I feel in that situation you are trying to use as few words as possible to express a thought, and I feel like you can do this in books as well. Why use a whole chapter to express what you can do in 3 paragraphs? So I feel like definitely I prefer that people get to the point. When they don't get to the point, it just feels like a lot of word clutter, and that is distracting to me. That is not to say that I don't appreciate really beautiful sentences, really wonderful style, the great use of simile and metaphor in writing. I just think you can do all those things and not have a lot of other stuff that's just clutter in it. Can you tell that I'm very passionate about this? Number 4, do you prefer books that introduce you to new ideas and issues or books that purely aim to entertain? This is another one that really does depend on my mood, because I do think in my life there's occasionally a place for a book that is just there to entertain me. However, I do gear towards books that do present new ideas, because I really like the psychology of people and learning about different kind of people, different time periods, different ways of thinking that aren't my own. I'm just kind of weird. Like, I always see new ideas even in the books that are just there to entertain me, because for some reason I have to analyze the heck out of it. So I'm always going to get a new idea, I think, out of every book that I read, whether I plan to or not. Number 5, do you enjoy books with graphic descriptions of violence, swearing, or sex, etc., or do you actively avoid them? I have to say that I do really appreciate books that don't use any of those things and still can create a really great, excellent, layered, awesome story. And I really prefer if I can get a hold of those books. However, I don't actively avoid books that include these graphic things, as you might see by all the books that I've read and even ones that I've given really high ratings. The reason for that is that even though I'm a Christian and I might have my own personal values and ways that I would view how I want to live my life, I don't go into books trying to read what I view my life like. I have accepted the fact that unless I'm just going to only read children's and Christian fiction, that, you know, books are going to include sex, violence, and maybe some cursing in the books, just because that is part of some people's human experience. And I'm not going to judge their human experience because it's not what I would personally do. Now, I do have kind of stipulations for each thing, if you will. Sex in a book, to me, just slows down the story. I think it's not something that needs to be graphically described. Cursing kind of comes back to the fact that it can become verbal clutter. Sometimes when people are frustrated and genuinely upset, they will curse, but I do think there's a point where you can just use curse words for the sake of using curse words. For example, I'm going to use the book Nick and Nora's Infinite Playlist. This book was very enjoyable in terms of the characters and the relationships, but I got so distracted by the amount of cursing that was in this book, and then I couldn't even figure out what the sentence was trying to say. I really don't mind violence. I like a good, like, fight scene. I do think the author has to be responsible with the violence. We can't have violence just to be violent. You have to have a motivation behind that, or it just doesn't make sense to even have the violence in there. Like, why do you need it? And I would say that for all these things that are graphic. Number 6, do you typically go for specific genres, and why? The question should really be, are there any genres that I avoid? Because I will pretty much read almost every genre, including nonfiction. I just love reading widely, and I've always found it really fun to read widely because it's really interesting when you do that, because you do see, like, something that you might have seen in a contemporary novel will carry over into maybe a science fiction novel, or something that you read in a science fiction novel will carry over to a historical fiction, or back and forth. And I think that's really interesting. I think each new reading experience from a different genre can actually, you know, make you better enjoy the genres as a whole and books as a whole. The only thing that I do actively kind of avoid because of aforementioned thoughts is erotica. Don't pick that genre up, but every other genre I'm like, yes. And number 7 is, what is your favorite genre busting book? I picked 2 books that I discovered this year that I found really interesting because they did explore so many different genres within their story. So the first one is Lisey's Story by Stephen King, a super dark urban fantasy, but it is also a psychological thriller. It is also sort of a love story about mourning, and so it definitely combines a lot of normal human feelings with a lot of intense dark fantasy and fantastical elements, and also some of, like, the horror elements that Stephen King is known for. The cool thing about it was it never felt like there was too much stuff going on in the story. I think because all the craziness that was going on with the fantastical, psychological, thriller, horror elements really showed how important the love story elements were, and made that bond of the 2 characters involved in the love story seem really interesting. And then the other thing that I wanted to talk about were the first 2 books in Tad Williams's Otherland series. I've yet to read the last 2 books, so we'll see what I think of those. It is a science fiction novel, but it also incorporates a lot of fantasy. It has some minor dystopian elements, and the second book really does include kind of a murder investigation. There's even, like, when I think about it, some, like, historical fiction things and a lot of references to classic literature. It's not just a story about people investigating a virtual network. It's like a little bit more, and I think that's really cool, and I'm kind of excited to finish up the series to see if Tad Williams throws any more crazy genres into the mix. That was the Genre Buster tag. I hope you enjoyed hearing my little discussion answers to these questions, and I hope you will also further discuss them in the comments because I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts. So I'm going to tag Bree Hill, A Stitch in Time, Tales of Adventure, and Georgina Reads, and I'm really excited to see what you guys come up with. In other news, the reading excerpt that you guys picked is on its way. I started editing it and all that, and then I realized that I'd forgotten to read a section of the book. So hopefully that will be up next week so that it is up in November as I promised. That is all I have to say for today. Thank you for watching, fabulous peeps. Bye!